that you could build this digital business that you could run from anywhere and connect with people from all over the world. It really, for me, was this fascination with how do you, what I now call, live local and grow global.
Hello and welcome to Ethical Fields Conversation on Three Horizons around community wealth building. This week we're joined, and it's our pleasure to be joined with Rebel Black. Hi Rebel.
Hey Woody.
Rebel, it's so good to be able to have a conversation with you today. I'm excited for what ground we might cover, so it'll be pretty cool. But for those who haven't met you, can you maybe explain who you are and where you are in the world so that they can get a bit of context?
Absolutely. So I'm here on Uwallerai country in Lightning Ridge, which is in outback New South Wales, 70 kilometres south of the Queensland border and roughly halfway across the state in New South Wales. And we are an opal mining community. Black opal is found here, 90% of the world's black opal. People may know it from now pretty popular television show called Outback Opal Hunters. They'll see it on a map. People are getting a lot more familiar with this location as a result of that TV. So I've been here 21 years, which is now half my life. So I passed that milestone in January, and this community is quite diverse. It's very multicultural. We have over 52 nationalities represented in this population that says question mark when you drive into town. It's small. There's about 2,500 people according to the census, but quite a few people who live off-grid, so maybe more likely up to the 5,000 mark, and about 100,000 visitors a year. So it's a very popular tourism destination, and with COVID last year, those numbers significantly increased as people were circling to get across to the Queensland border, and then also just travelling in New South Wales, regional New South Wales, because they couldn't go anywhere else. So I started my first business here at the age of 22. I moved here as the editor of the newspaper, which doesn't exist anymore. And I started that job using film in the camera. So the news period ended basically at lunchtime on a Monday, when I would have to get the film developed, and then it would have to get in a car and drive to Dubbo, where the paper was then put together. So basically the paper came out on a Thursday, but the news week finished on a mid-morning Monday. So it's a pretty long lag. And it just amazes me that in such a short period of time, things have changed, so much. But I've basically been building businesses ever since, and my latest, which is really where you and I reconnected, was The Rural Woman, which we launched in 2014, and we're in the process of transitioning from a PTY company to a cooperative, which is very exciting.
And can we just go into The Rural Woman for a while? So can you talk to me about how that business started and up to present day, where you're converting from a company to a cooperative? But what was the story up to this point?
Yeah, so I'd been, I guess the story started with my own journey of healing, and being quite physically and emotionally unwell for periods of time in a very geographically remote, isolated community where there isn't high levels of access to service. And so fortunately, we had the internet, and so I was able to get, this whole new world opened up to me, that I could live in this little town but be connected to this incredible resource of, kinesiologists and people that were thinking differently. I remember my very first coaches, this online world of building businesses in this online world. We'd had websites for previous businesses, but that you could build this digital business that you could run from anywhere and connect with people from all over the world. It really, for me, was this fascination with how do you, what I now call, live local and grow global. And Then I was working as a coach with a whole lot of rural women, coaching them in life and in business and in their health and well-being, and realizing there was this extraordinary talent at the heart of our country that was being ignored, and whose voices who had almost become so voiceless they couldn't even hear themselves, let alone be heard by anybody else. And it was really troubling me, and I felt compelled, like I just kept asking, what do I do about this? How do I change this? And then, as all good ideas do, it came knocking at 3 a.m. In the morning. I had to get out of bed, take my notebook out, and I just downloaded this business, this idea that we would reconnect rural women to their most powerful voices and then provide platforms from which that voice could be amplified. And I literally built a website the next day, and I called on the community of women that I had around me already to invite them to contribute to the blog, basically. Who blogs these days? I don't know. And, and we got our first contributors, and that is literally how it started. And really the principles of that business haven't changed. That was in 2014. I had a business partner, Phoebe Maroulis, for 12 months. And we did a lot of digging into who we were as an entity, what was our mission, vision, our branding, what did we stand for? And for us, it became, the stands for thriving, healing, and evolving. Those were our core missions. And that was what we were standing for our community. And our ultimate goal is that rural women bloom where they are. And it doesn't matter to us where they are, who they are, how they bloom, when they bloom, on what form, how many times, none of that matters to us, but that they know that is really important to us. And that we've acted always as an advocate for thriving, healing, and evolving communities and new narratives and new stories for rural Australia and rural communities and people around the world. And that the business, obviously, all I knew at the time to do was to build a business, start a company, register a business name, build a business. But I knew even from that very first day that this had to be owned by the women that it served. And I knew at some point it would become another kind of entity. And it's interesting because, we looked at shares and shareholdership, and I'd had a lot to do with the not-for-profit sector, and I knew I definitely didn't want to build a traditional not-for-profit association. I knew it didn't want to be a company because there's a lot around corporation law and other things that I don't agree with, and I believe needs to change. And I got exposed to co-ops. I realize now, I thought it was only last year or the year before when you and I reconnected for the platform cooperative course, but I actually found a notebook the other day from 2016, and I had met a lady from BCCM at a conference somewhere. She'd blown my mind. Then I reread a message I'd sent to someone else in 2017 telling them about co-ops and how we should look at it from a legacy point of view for business, and so I realized that it had been, the student wasn't quite ready, but the teacher was there, planting seeds. And then, 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, the platform cooperative course came up, and, as they say, the rest is history. Here we are.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about your plan to convert from a company to a platform cooperative, but I want to talk a bit about the blooming for a second. I don't know what award it was, but I remember seeing your little line on a map go from Lightning Ridge to Sydney to Paris. What was that award?
So it's the one behind me, the beautiful golden woman. It was a Women in Tech Global Award, and we won the jury's choice, the coup de coeur, which is my terrible pronunciation of French. Sounded beautiful in French. That was really a recognition of the work we'd done in tech for rural women, because what I didn't say was that all of our work has been done mostly online. Like, we've literally run maybe 3 or 4 events in the last 6 years or 7 years that have been offline. And we've run thousands of online events and workshops, and we have an online community and platform. So we really have been driving an agenda of digital connectivity for rural women since day one, because that was my experience, that I could live in Lightning Ridge and get support to thrive and heal and evolve, grow a business that had a global, reach and a global opportunity, and do it all from, the edge of the opal fields in remote Australia. And so we had to, that's been our platform, has been that the internet gives us choice to live where we want to live, love where we want to live, and still contribute, earn a wage, make money, make a difference. And so that award, I guess, was recognition for that work that we've done, particularly for rural women.
I mean, you're uniquely positioned to answer this question. If the rural woman hadn't come into existence with your insight at 3 a.m. in the morning and determination to make it real, what would have been the trajectory, I imagine, for women living physically, geographically isolated? Like, what did the path look like, or where would we have been without the injection of the rural woman?
I mean, the ego part of me says, well, the false ego says life would go on. People would still do what they do. To say that we've had a huge impact, to me, I feel is naive. However, what I've witnessed for myself, and therefore have also seen in others, is this idea that we can live in rural communities and do our greatest work without having to leave, without having to ask for permission, without having to feel bad. Because those were all the things I was shown as a young woman, leaving school. The opportunities were leave home, leave school, leave your community, pretty much, that were on the table. My parents definitely were not encouraging us to stay on the farm. There was all, and because I was smart and I'd achieved highly, it was like you would have failed if you'd stayed. And so that was the narrative I was taught, and it was indoctrinated in us, that, and we still tell that story, that we have to leave in order to succeed. And that somehow if you come back, you've failed, even though our communities spend a lot of time talking about how we want to bring our kids home, But also in doing that, bringing people home, we turn our back on the greatest asset that we actually have, which is those people who do remain in their communities. And through the Rural Woman, I've really wanted us to spotlight and highlight and amplify the voices of the women who've never left, the women who have raised their families, have been in farming, in farming businesses or businesses in town, or have been wonderful employees, who have contributed on, committees and given their lives over to their communities. And where do we talk about the incredible women that are doing that, and because those women are now creating jobs for other women and men and leading young women to different paths, saying to them, you can stay here and still live a great life. You haven't failed if you remain in your small country town that you grew up in. In fact, the opposite. So for me, we're at the beginning, right at the beginning of a culture shift. I feel like we've been, kind of paving the way for a different conversation about what permission we have as women in rural communities. And we'll do that forever.
Does that mean that the problems that caused you to start the business are still here? And can you articulate what they are?
They are, yeah. The problems, so geography is the first and obvious one to speak to. Geographic remoteness does, even with the internet, does still present barriers. And it costs more to not necessarily live in these places, because you can live really affordably, but it costs more to go to other places. So if your business if you're being told you have to come to Sydney for meetings, or if you need to be in those places of power or where decisions are being made, there's a cost, a financial cost, a community, a business cost, an adrenal cost, you know, a personal well-being cost. And so that, you know, there's also that idea that if you're not seen, you don't exist. And so if you're not pounding the pavements, you don't have the same geographic opportunity to pound the pavements or knock on the doors of big corporates or, you know, we're in the hallways of power in our governments, etc. There are opportunities that just never come your way. So geography still remains. We're never going to change that. That literally is practically impossible to change. But our perception of that can shift. And 3 years ago, I made the decision that if I was going to run an online business and I was going to truly lead rural women to the revolution that the internet could really give us, that I had to stop traveling for work. And so I drew the line in the sand and I said, I'm not traveling for work, for nothing, not speaking gigs, not workshops, not meetings. I lost 20 speaking gigs that year, but my business doubled. And for me, that's the power of saying, you know, we have the technology. Why aren't we using it? You know, I lost 20 speaking gigs. And then a year later, COVID happened. And all of a sudden, everybody has to use Zoom, you know. And I opened my Zoom account a decade ago.
Yeah, right.
And we've been using Zoom in this way since 2014. And I think maybe my Zoom account's not quite a decade, but, you know, it's close. And I think it's really the problem isn't always the access, it's our perception of access. And people complain about not having great internet, and yet my internet here in Lightning Ridge was better than the web developer I worked with for a number of years in Melbourne, in the CBD. But yet we're complaining we've got bad access. But it's really a perception. If you believe what everybody's telling you, then you miss the brilliant opportunities that are there that that the rural woman has been tapping into. And what we saw with COVID was the women that had been working with the rural woman and been a part of our ecosystem for a number of years pivoted instantly because they didn't have to learn a new technology. They knew Zoom. They'd been Zooming with us for years. They understood how to run an online event. They understood, you know, all of the back-end systems that came with that because they'd had exposure to it for years. So for them, there was no panic. It was just, oh, okay, well, now those things we thought we could do, wanted to do offline, we now just shift to online and it was no worries. So it's the problems often that we think we have are just perceptions. And I think that's what we want to do a lot. We want to challenge a lot of those assumptions that we're making in rural communities that aren't actually, in fact, true anymore.
If you don't mind talking to me about, you know, maybe a town that doesn't have a rebel, a lightning. Not every town has what you've got in Lightning Ridge, which is a beautiful tourism industry, some really eccentric characters, disparity of wealth, but there is some wealth there. There's like an amazing pool built by black opals, right?
Yeah.
What happens to the towns that don't have these empowered women, that don't have or have perceptions that they're isolated and disconnected and inaccessible? What, you know, can you name a town that's had that sort of experience, and what characterizes it for you?
To me, it comes to a single belief, and that is scarcity. So for me, the source of most of our issues is that we don't believe there's enough. And that's personally, you know, time, money, opportunities, etc. If we're coming from a place where there's not enough, it doesn't matter how hard we look in the world, we'll never find enough of any of those things. And so if there's a culture of that within enough people, there'll be a tipping point at which a community then adopts that as their dominant narrative. They say there's never enough. And those communities are the ones that you'll see constantly blaming government, constantly blaming, you know, the weather, the neighbour, you know, everybody else for the problems that they perceive in their communities, that there isn't enough, there's never enough money, there's never enough whatever. It is. And, you know, everyone will be thinking of towns that they've heard of in the mainstream media now. I don't have to name them. But where there just seems to be this endless pit of resourcing, but nothing changes. And it's because the belief hasn't ever been addressed. And the belief is that there isn't enough. And so where there are communities where there are enough people, enough, you know, driving forces, enough leaders who believe there's enough and can see that there's enough and that there's abundance, then you will see the, you know, that community adopts that, and they are the proactive communities. They're the communities that, it's not that they're problem free, it's that they approach their perspective on the problem from a place of abundance, not scarcity. So what we see with the scarcity driven communities is they shrink. Yep. They shrink, their resourcing gets smaller, their population gets smaller. They're the communities that are, you know, all their kids have left home. They're left with an aging population, you know, their prices of their houses fall, industries leave, etc. So those are the symptoms we see and that we'll hear about or witness for ourselves. Whereas those where there's, you know, a nurturing, if you like, of the abundance belief and mentality and a culture that comes from that, is that's where you'll see the communities that are building new enterprises, who are supporting their leaders to do great work, who are backing people into those crazy, audacious plans, you know, and who are, and that's been, fortunately for me, that was my experience within my family, my community that I grew up, the school that I went to in Coonabarabran. And then as I moved as a 21-year-old to Lightning Ridge, this place has collectively an abundant mentality. And so I've been raised, fortunately, with a greater sense of abundance than of scarcity. And that doesn't mean I haven't had moments and times of feeling like there wasn't enough, but on, you know, the balance, it's been that. And so where we see communities succeeding is where they've got leaders with an abundance mindset and a growth mindset, and where even despite the bureaucracies or the structures that seek to inhibit that, despite that, those communities just say, screw it, we're doing it anyway.
It's so true. I mean, aside from Lightning Ridge, can you give us a few examples maybe of the Rural Woman members and what they're doing in their communities that are like seeds for hope, seeds for change, things that you're like, imagine every town did that. Yeah.
Well, immediately springs to mind it is actually my hometown of Coonabarabran, but where one of our members, Viv Evans, has been driving change there for many, many years. And particularly originally when we first met her through the Rural Woman in the Girl Guides and really leading that amazing movement across New South Wales. But then she really wanted to do her own work, you know, what was her genius. And she's just started her own business, which she runs fully independently now, you know, moved out of jobs. She's now creating contracts and employment for other women, doing innovative things, trying to collaborate and bring communities together through online treasure hunts, which she calls goose chases, and bringing, you know, show committees together and tourism providers together. And we've got quite a few women in that community who also work together. Donna Burton, who's Donna the astronomer, is also someone who I think about as well, you know, who's leading the way in astronomy as a woman in a very typically male-dominated industry, and who's bringing together the narrative of being raised as what she describes as a drover's brat, and her love of astronomy, and bringing the two together in this beautiful storytelling. And she's also a collaborator, you know, Chamber of Commerce, and bringing people together. And I think that's what women do particularly well, is when they're operating in abundance and they're operating, you know, in that feminine way, is they want to collaborate. They're like literally magnetized for collaboration. And it's only, you know, capitalist patriarchal systems that have told us that was the wrong way for a long time that we forgot. But there's lots of us remembering that is the best way for us to grow as communities. Yeah, there's a few others, but to me, it's what I'm seeing is where the leadership for me is not about position. It's something that people do instinctively, and sometimes those people have positions and sometimes they don't. But for me, where I'm seeing communities shift, the ripple effect, we say when a rural woman blooms, all around her bloom too. It's a powerful and deeply felt ripple. Where we see that ripple effect happening is where those women have given themselves the support of great personal and professional development, which the rural woman provides, and community that isn't their local community, but is this broader community of like-minded women who are championing change in their own unique way. No one's going to give that to people. People have had to find that themselves, and the structures in our communities typically don't support that. Our governments, they're two different beasts. Entrepreneurs, innovators, creators, and people who work in government are very different people. And so to expect those organizations or institutions to support those, creators and innovators and entrepreneurs is hopeful, but is probably not realistic. And so we've got to create those ecosystems ourselves.
Brilliant. I love what you said about when a rural woman blooms, those around her bloom. And I want to give you a metaphorical power to cast a wand and wish into existence a future that has women in regions blooming everywhere. What does that community and society and economy, that community wealth in aggregate, what does it look like for you in 10 years if that is blooming going off?
Yeah. I'm reminded of the shaman's way. So one of my teachers, Medicine Crow, talks about, the 10 principles of the shaman. And one of them is energy flows where attention goes. For me, it's the story that we tell the most is the story of the people who are blooming, and that we allow them platforms where they tell their own stories confidently and that they can proclaim their bloom, whatever that is, safely and confidently, and that they are heralded and praised for that instead of the opposite, which is, we know in Australia is the tall poppy. And it's where there are no more wars on things, no more wars on drugs, terrorism, all the things we rail against, that the women that are blooming are leading conversations around what we want, not what we don't want, or what we've got too much of, etc. So to me, the evidence will be, the shift will be, the tipping point will be where there is abundance conversations, and that we're no longer telling stories of lack, or we're no longer blaming someone else, that we take full responsibility and that we take action from a place of responsibility. And it does look like a revolution to wealth. The RW also stands for the revolution to wealth, as well as the rural woman, and wealth in all forms. Wealth in financial wealth, wealth in community, wealth in landscape, environment, where we understand that there is enough, but we don't behave as if it's never going to run out, where we take care of things, of people, of place, and of philosophy as well. So it's not, I don't think it's symptom free, but our greatest storytelling comes from what's working and what we're succeeding at, as opposed to the opposite.
Beautiful. And I'm going to just ask one last question before I bring Gareth on. I see what you've done, or in the process of doing, converting your company where traditionally, you as the founder would be the driving force of this, and you're moving it into a cooperative where you're going to be a singular member like every other member in the network, that has a catalytic effect on the ability for women everywhere and for the communities they live in to bloom. So that's my understanding of why you're, doing this conversion. But what's your understanding of the conversion? What's driving it from your perspective?
It's the succession model in both for myself personally and for a different way of doing business to me. And so I'm a starter of things. Like, to be honest, to have been in this business for this long has been a slog, because I'm a creator. I'm an innovator. I'm a creator. I am the leader of the wave. Like, I get bored really fast with the mundane stuff, that you need to do to run a business. Please don't make me do that again. But I knew, and I had to, literally, there have been several turning points in the business where I almost had to tie myself to the chair to force myself to not quit, because I knew that this entity had to live on beyond me, and that in order for it to do that, it needed a different structure. So for me, the succession plan out of a company is, you sell it to someone else who does the same as you, who's the driving force, etc., and probably would scale it better than I could personally from my skills point of view. Or you close it, or that's about it, whereas with the co-op model, it says, actually, we've been serving these women. They're smart enough to run this themselves. They are the reason it exists. They're the only reason it exists. And so why would we not trust them with the ownership and the management and the, the success of the entity that they serve and it serves, and it serves in return? And so when we started floating this idea, which I, started talking about it 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, just planting the seed. And now we've got women that are so excited by this model, not just because of the rural woman, but because they understand that this shows them another way too, for the way they do business. And that's really important to me, is that this entity is not just serving well as an entity, but that it is leading the change that we want to see as well. And I'm looking forward to being one member in tens of thousands who is contributing my ideas, my hopes, my aspirations, my expertise, my passion, and my desire to learn and, thrive and heal and evolve myself. And which I still see myself as that. It's just that I've had to be the one showing up every day, to do that. And I know that this entity will do so much better when I'm not that person, because I don't have those skills, and there are so many other people who will. And there are exciting models we don't even know about how that's going to happen as well, that the collective wisdom will bring.
Brilliantly articulated. I'm going to ask Gareth, my colleague, to come and join us. Gareth, have you been able to make a picture of this? I've just shared with you co-hosting.
Okay, hopefully you can see the screen.
Yep.
Okay, so I missed the bit about stiff gins, but I really felt I had to include it. So you're the first one to have a little bit of a video on there as well. So I think we start off with the idea of lightning ridge and the Black Opal country, back New South Wales, and I loved it. The kind of the story about the news stops mid-morning Monday because it takes time to go and get the film developed. That was great. But then you talked about the sort of, I suppose, the situation and that. I think that there were many powerful things that you said, but that the voice so voiceless, the women were so voiceless that they couldn't hear themselves. I think was came across really strongly, and This idea that I'm just thinking I've just covered up a bit that should be there. But basically, there was a bit here that I must have moved. The idea that you had this idea on the notebook at 3 a.m. that went in, was up the next day. Then it was people were blogging, by the afternoon, and then that took on its life of its own, and it's become a rural, the rural woman. And we'll kind of pick up that story later. I've also got to find out what happened to those things. There we are. In terms of the sort of things that we kind of do, like what happens if things stay the same. So this narrative, we have to success is leaving and to return is failure. That there is, yes, geographic remoteness. It does cost more to go other places, but some of it's about perception. There are real things about not being seen in the corridors of power. So that's supposed to be kind of Canberra there. But then you kind of really spoke powerfully about the abundance mindset and the mindset of there's enough, and the ways of using that, the 10 years on Zoom, and using those kind of ideas. So you had lots of metaphors. You talked about ripples, and we had the where rural and bloom where they are. And this is thank you to Viv, because this is from her Facebook group. I just thought that was appropriate. But you talked about a few examples. The goose chase takes flight. What Viv was doing in terms of making it happen, but all this, and it was underpinned by this idea of like an abundance mindset, saying there is enough, going over that dialectic of the perception that there isn't enough and there'll never be enough, and we have this shrinking community versus there is enough and we can make these plans and we can do things, and making those crazy audacious plans, as I think you put them. And then I think you returned at the end then to the kind of rural woman, and particularly this idea of succession planning. And I think this idea as well of often the people who start these things are not the ones who are able to kind of operationalize them and carry them on. And one of our speakers from a week or two ago to talk about exactly that, and she was in the other place. She loved doing the operational stuff, and I think this is just a lovely kind of way of seeing that, as not of we've just got to sell, or we've just got to take the normal path. We can actually say, well, actually, this frees me up to do the next thing, and actually, the people who are members of it are trusted to be able to do this and operationalize it in a way and take it forward. And then up in the sort of the desired future state, which might need a bit more building out. He said, pointing at Woody, that you can live in rural communities and do your best work there. I think that was one of the things that you said that was really stood out. I'm sorry, I've lost a bit here. I'm going to have to try and find it and put it back later. But that was just your notebook. That was your notebook piece. It's gone AWOL. So is there any big things that I've missed? There was so much there. Any big things that I've missed that you'd like me to put back in?
Not that I can think of. I don't know if there's something missing that Wardy heard, but yeah, certainly you've captured it beautifully, Gareth. Thank you.
Sure.
Gareth, great job. I think we're going to move now to, basically there's a dystopian scarcity future, one which could lead to the shrinkage of community wealth. And there's a utopian kind of ideal where we can all bloom where we are and have that ripple effect and build community wealth. And those two outcomes, no one knows, like no one's got the crystal ball, right? But this is the messy middle. Like, what can we do to nudge it in the direction of the preferred future and away from that direction of dystopia? So I wanted to talk to you and ask you around, what do you think are the big levers for helping people to bloom and have abundance in their local community, as opposed to, or maybe avoiding shrinkage and scarcity in a local community? What are the big levers for you?
The big levers for me are probably the most difficult to acquire for the masses, but they are around energy and belief systems.
Right.
And it's changing the story, I guess, in a reverse engineered way. So for me, if people believe there's not enough, the behavior that comes from that is never going to change, while ever they believe that to be true. It's like, I always describe the belief systems like the engine in the car. You can put a Datsun B20 engine inside a Porsche skin and it looks beautiful, but it drives like crap, and I feel like that's what happens a lot of the time, is we try and wrap bad belief systems or flawed belief systems or belief systems that don't serve us anymore in beautiful skins, in whatever form that is. More money, bigger industries, rescue packages, blah, blah, blah. But actually, we've got to shift the engine. And the way that, as a coach, when I'm listening to people, when they're talking to me, I'm listening for the stories they're telling and the language they're using that gives me the clues to what the belief systems are that they're running, what the engine is they're running. And in rural Australia, we love the battler, the hard luck, the guy that was down on his, to the skin of his teeth, and we just love it. We love the hard life story, and we hate the tall poppy. And if that belief stays firm, then it doesn't matter what else we do, that it's still that where there's a dominant culture around life is hard, it has to be hard, you've got to work hard, there's never enough rain, and then when there is rain, it's in the wrong places and it was at the wrong time, you can really hear the belief systems. So until we do that personal development as humans, and as Gandhi said, be the change, and until we each individually shift those belief systems, we won't reach the critical mass that then enables the bigger behavior change to really occur. So to me, the lever is the conversation and then personal work on the belief systems, naming them, knowing them, understanding them, shifting them, talking about things differently, understanding the connection between language and beliefs. And the energy that then sits around those beliefs. So the energy of scarcity is small and tight, tightly held wealth in the hands of a few, the scarcity is, it feels constrictive. It feels small. People get smaller. They shrink in their human sense as well. So if we shift the energy around that and we teach people how to hear themselves, to be the voice that they can hear, to give them platforms for that voice, to teach them how to stand tall, expand their energy, believe there's enough, everything else it's the ripple. That is the fulcrum that will create the lever, that will create the significant change. But while ever we keep talking about behavior changes, we're kind of pushing, the domino halfway down down the road. And so that it's that work. But that's work no one wants to do. Everyone wants the pill. Just give me the pill, man. But it requires a tipping point of enough people having a different belief system to the dominant one that then leads to the tipping point for a culture shift.
It's so insightful, right, what you're saying, because I know when we work together that the products you're developing are financial products, right? They're to help ease that funding gap that enables women to bloom where they are, whether that's providing a short-term funding or a longer-term business funding. But it's linked to their personal development and their learning goals. Do you want to talk to me about how you've taken that really material financial need and linked it with the immaterial but essential beliefs, and how you came to that lever?
Well, so first of all, there's no, if you're not part of a professional association, you know, an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, where legislation requires you to do PD, you know, professional development points, there's almost nothing in rural communities other than the odd random workshop that someone scored some funding for, or where you've got consultants coming in to do it. But personal development only addresses skills gaps, and it very rarely addresses human gaps, you know, or beliefs or the mindset. So right from the beginning, the Rural Woman, because it's my passion, has been looking at how do you do both? How do you help people understand themselves in a really powerful way and then give them the chance to develop themselves personally at the same time as sharpening their tools, you know, getting those skills improvements. So we've always melded the two. In fact, we actually have a higher priority on the personal development than we do on the professional, because I've seen time and time again that when you help a woman understand herself deeply, she actually realizes there's a whole lot of skills that she couldn't even see herself that she has, that we just had to help her open her eyes to. So that's what I've seen. It's what I've witnessed in thousands of women in the last 7 years. And it's also what sets us apart from what everyone else is doing. You know, it's like the sweet spot. But when we started the co-op when we were talking about the co-op, and we thought one of the big gaps that was identified was access to funds, you know, for rural women, particularly in startup, small business, a micro enterprise, as well as, you know, startup business. And access to money is still a challenge for women generally, and then rural women especially. So we started thinking, but if we just try and solve people's problems with money, they're approaching it from the same mindset that they got them there in the first place, you know? Nothing will change. We'll just give them money and nothing will change. So much like what they've done in a lot of the developing countries with women's self-help groups and with micro-lending, with organizations like Grameen Bank, is they've tied community and sisterhood and accountability of the community and to also professional and personal development. And that money comes linked to a responsibility to self, to invest time and effort in your own development, and in mindset and personal and, you know, and in professional as well. One of our board members, Diana Jacobson, always says, she's an accountant and a financial planner, and she says you can't fix cash flow with cash. And it's so true. You know, it's like if you just, and we've seen this in communities over years, millions, hundreds of millions in some instances of money gone into communities to solve problems, big problems, systemic problems, and it's worse a decade later despite the cash injection, because you cannot fix human problems with system solutions. You cannot fix cash flow problems with cash. The lack of cash is a symptom of other things that are going on in the entity, and you've got to figure out what those other things are and solve those problems. So
sorry, keep going.
So we just knew we had to make sure the two were linked, you know, that the goals of, you know, just helping a woman achieve access to capital was not separate to, that was really intrinsically, there was an imperative actually that they also undertake that development process.
Thank you, Rebel. What's the best way, or, you know, the way that could nudge to better outcomes, that we could set up policy or that government could interact to get better outcomes? What are the levers there that you can see, and which ones do you have hope for?
Well, hopefully government could shift to an abundance belief system as well. You know, we'll just utopia.
Put that in the far right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are a representative of the voice of our nation. So there could come a time where that was actually the case, you know, where there was, you know, that belief system tipping point. I think if we, you know, we've done a survey of hundreds of women around this topic, you know, access to money, what their hopes and aspirations are. What if, if they had a magic wand for government, what would it be? And it's simplicity, and it's not making things harder. It's like all these women were saying they didn't need much money, to make a massive difference. Their lever or their fulcrum point was a few $1,000s sometimes. But because of the requirements, the paperwork, the hoops that you've got to jump through, etc., it becomes either impossible or ridiculous and not even worth the effort. So there's that. But there's also, I'm not a big fan of, quotas and the other one, I keep forgetting the word. But I've seen, I believe that there are some really great success stories as a result of Supply Nation and a legislated requirement for government to put their money in particular places. And obviously with Supply Nation, it's into Indigenous businesses. Now, those things have become open for people doing the wrong thing. And, there are some examples of people doing that. But as a rule, what we've seen is really great Indigenous businesses get into those halls of power, have their business amplified, accelerated, supported, etc., to achieve growth, which then leads to, great outcomes for people, employment, capacity building, people feeling great about themselves, etc. So I believe that if for rural women, for women generally, but particularly obviously for us, for rural women, a procurement policy of a similar nature and a strategy that, around that kind of work would actually be, I think, highly beneficial if it was done in an appropriate way. And that's certainly something that we've been discussing, through the Rural Woman for some years, is to say that money moved from there to there probably doesn't have a big impact here in terms of, big companies' bottom lines, but it has an extraordinarily huge ripple effect over here. And that's what I'm most interested in, is the 5-degree shifts. Like, I think Supply Nation, it's 3% of government spend. It's a tiny percentage, but it's a massive sum. And to those hundreds of businesses who access it, it makes a massive difference on the ground. That's really genuinely felt in communities, in those communities where those Indigenous people are. So it's those sort of policy things that really, to me, speak. And also not just throwing money at things, but genuinely engaging in dialogue with community who have the solution. Trust is paramount. Governments don't trust people, and people don't trust governments. And wherever there's a lack of trust, there'll be a lack of, transformation. And so in order for communities to get the best outcomes for themselves, the government needs to trust those communities, know what they need, and then trust them to deliver that, and then just give it to them. I've met with so many bureaucrats over the years here in Lightning Ridge and other places. And this one guy said, if you could have anything, what would your magic wand be to solve community problems, And I said, I'd find more people like me and I'd just pay them really well to just do their best work. I literally would just pay us, because right now we have to try and pay ourselves. And there's a whole lot of work required to do that. That means some do and some don't. But I would just find people like the innovators and creators and entrepreneurs and the people who just give and give and give, and I would resource the hell out of them. And governments, for all the reasons, don't believe that's possible. And so they keep doing things the way that they've always done them. So how do we improve trust between those parties? It would be, that would be, to me, the panacea.
It's a great lever point. I guess more digital kind of thoughts. What's the role of technology in maybe enabling trust or enabling those local organisers, innovators, creators to be discoverable, I guess, and to give them those platforms? What's the role of technology, and how would you like to see us use technology so we end up with thriving communities as opposed to, I think they call them sponge communities, where, you know, Orange and Dubbo are soaking up the smaller towns. You know, how does technology enable us to get thriving as opposed to?
Well, I don't understand blockchain, Wardy. Like, just saying that right up front. Don't get it. It does my head in. Don't even understand how telephone works. So technology, from an understanding point of view, we still sit around the table and I go, how do you send a fax? How did they do that? So, but I understand the power that it creates, that connection, that ability to connect in places where you previously weren't able to, is incredibly powerful. And those sponge communities, like, imagine a blockchain. I mean, the little I understand of it, imagine a blockchain where for every dollar that exits a little town like Lightning Ridge and leaves to a Dubbo or a Toowoomba or a Sydney or whatever, in school fees, in shopping, in, whatever, there's some blockchain thing that enables, for every dollar spent there, there's 10 cents that comes back. Could you imagine? Like, literally, we tried to sum up the other day, just in the people I know who've sent their kids to boarding school. It's tens of millions of dollars in under a decade left to this tiny little town of under 3,000 people, replicated across our nation and across every nation on this planet. And that, like, technology could fix that like that. And it wouldn't have to be a conversation that I've had over many years with mayors in towns saying, listen, you guys have got millions of dollars pouring into your communities from our little town. How about you invest in some infrastructure that's going to build our community? Because if there's more people here, there's going to be a ripple effect for you. Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. But no, because we have to invest in our town. Our ratepayers won't be very happy if we start investing in yours. But if you had blockchain that took out that middleman, that just did that for you, that would be incredibly powerful for these little towns. And then these little towns have a discretionary budget that sits with a community organisation or some, organization that distributes that wealth in some ways, comes back into local businesses or whatever. I mean, we saw the power of the Buy from the Bush campaign and the Buy from a Bush business, and the 3 marketplaces that have come from that, that one thing, and the power of that. Now, speaking to cooperatives, imagine if they were owned by the women, not just a few people, but owned by the women that they were serving, or the men. And so it's about looking at how does technology help us build new structures as well? So as my teacher, Christine McDougall, says, are we rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, or are we building new ships? And I think technology, if we use it effectively, enables us to build new ships. But the answers are already here. All the answers lie within. We've already got them. And technology, we've always had, this talking is technology, it's just that we've got phones and things that connect us quicker. But I mean, telepathy is a real thing, right? So where are we going back to the old school stuff too, by recognizing we can also communicate in ways that don't require AI or a chip in your arm?
I think it's harder to send a eggplant emoji via telepathy than it is via MMS. Just saying for the kids. All right, where I've been enjoying the chat so much, I'm running us out of time. So Rebel, I'm going to move to your 3 kind of recommendations for the people that listen to this. Are like usually work in an economic development capacity or a community development capacity within their region, or they've come to us through co-ops or equity crowdfunding. So they're usually like active in this space, some more than others. But what are your 3 top tips or recommendations that could help those people move the community wealth building narrative?
We have to surrender the victim and rescuer habit.
Say that again. You have to
surrender the victim rescuer polarity, right? while ever there's a rescuer, there has to be a victim, and while ever there's a victim, there has to be a rescuer. That's the integrity of the structure.
Yep.
But if if one decides I'm not going to rescue people, or one decides I'm not going to be the victim, that collapses. And what we end up with is sovereignty, two agents with sovereignty. And I think for too long, many of us have operated as rescuers. We're like, people need rescuing, so we build things to rescue people, but actually they don't. And I think if we understand that people don't need rescuing, they have agency, they are sovereign beings, and what we all need is collaboration, is people being their best versions of themselves and enabling others to do the same. So that's the first thing, is stop rescuing people and stop believing you're a victim one way or another, whichever, because we can be both, I've been both. I sometimes still be both. It's hardwired, so we need to rewire that. The second is that all the answers lie within, and it sort of comes off that as well. That says if you are if people have agency and are sovereign, then that stands to true that they understand what's best for themselves. That goes for me as an individual, for all of us as individuals, for us as communities, as collectives, as nations, etc. The answers already exist for us. So what we've got to get good at is asking great questions. And I think the third is be willing to be uncomfortable, and that it's okay to sit in the messiness of not knowing for periods of time, to allow the answer to arise, to allow a great question to arise that allows, the next great question or whatever. And so I think we rush. And I have been by nature impatient, just want to do everything now. But the rural woman has taught me that gets you nowhere fast, and actually you've got to really do the work, the foundational work of who are you, what do you do, who do you serve, what are we here for, what's the legacy of this, how is this serving the next 10 generations. We have to sit in the uncomfortableness of not knowing, of not having all the answers, of not being the expert, and of just genuinely allowing the space for those things to bubble up and arise, instead of rushing to fill the gap and solve the problem and rescue people. And so I think they're all linked, but it's like, be willing to be uncomfortable and be willing to go places that are unfamiliar, and to have space in place, in conversation, in people, in relationships. And because we've spent years trying to close the gap, but no one's ever asked, what value does the gap have? What value does the gap have? And what if we put some attention there for a while? We might accidentally close it, because we're not focused on the chasm that exists. We're focusing on what sits in the gap and what beauty and richness can that provide us. So that's my advice for take it or leave it.
Oh, I'll love it. It's so refreshing, Rebel, to have this at such a human level discussion, because sometimes we can be so abstract, renewable energy will save our environment and our local communities, or this or that. So to bring it back to, the roles we play psychologically, the belief systems that we've grown up with and still exercise as adults, it's really fundamental and universally applicable. So thank you for sharing your hard experiences. Gareth, I'm going to get you to bring up your diagram picture, our Three Horizons chart, and close us out, if you will.
Sure. So the engine versus the tall poppy. So I wasn't quite sure I got the quote right, but the idea that we have these belief systems, but it's kind of the old dirty engine inside the the beautiful chassis, and this sort of we love the Aussie battler mentality, and we want to cut down our tall poppies. And I think you really went into this really deeply the idea of energy. You mentioned energy goes where attention goes, and the abundance mindset. And here it was like the idea of, take which pill are you going to take, and you're going to kind of take the kind of pill that moves to that abundance mindset. And I love the story about this idea of the finance and the beliefs, and so you tied that training and the idea of opening your eyes to yourself and being able to develop that inner wisdom and knowledge to be able to move, and so that cash wouldn't do it, throwing things at it wouldn't do it. It had to come from inside. I know we're running over time, so I'll go quickly. So the 5-degree shifts. So you talked a lot about what wasn't working. The projects that could just make things worse. They don't fix things. But on the other hand, those small differences can make a big difference on the ground with where people spend their money, the buying from the bush, sponge communities, and sort of that. I love the idea of the traceable cash. So there's always a bit that's coming back to the kind of community of origin, which is great. And then I put in government with an abundance mindset right at the top right there. So, and I think that reminded me of the quote. The actual the Australia's a lucky country run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. So there is that idea of abundance. We always forget, and luck, but we always forget the second part of it, of what's happened when it's run. And then we've got our answers that are sort of bubbling behind us. So surrender the victim and rescue a habit. Acknowledge that then there's sovereignty. Then there's a meeting of the best version of ourselves. The answers are inside, which I think ties back to what we were talking about before. And to find the answers, you've got to have the really great questions. And then sitting in the mess, we talk a lot about the messy middle, but really sitting in the mess and being deeply okay with that. And I love the idea of 7 generations, it's 10. And I think that kind of mindset is so important. There are things that have gone on in the world now that are going to last at least 10 generations already, and that we're experiencing some of those, and so we have to think that long, if not even longer out. So that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebel. Thank you, Gareth. A wonderful conversation. Rebel, I hope you'll come back and join us for another discussion someday. Otherwise, look forward to talking in the interwebs. Gareth, thank you for a wonderful scribe, and all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Wardy. Thanks, Gareth.